Hey, I'm Becca with the Happy Ever Crafter, and in this video I'm going to walk you through how I draw peonies, one big open peony like this and one little peony bud that I add to my work, so for wedding signage or in my bullet journal and things like that. By the way, I also have a free cheat sheet that walks you through every single step of this process if you wanted to try it again later or if you want to follow along that way. So make sure you grab that down below before we start, and let's jump right in. So for this video, I'm going to be using micron pens. These are size 1, 3, and 5, and micron pens are just nice monoline archival ink, just black ink. These are some of my favorites to use, but I want to stress that you don't have to use these pens. You can use any pens that you have lying around. Even just one single pen is totally fine. It doesn't have to be these, and they don't have to be fancy. For paper, I'm going to be using Rhodia paper. Rhodia is just a really nice, high quality type of paper. You can use any paper. It does not have to be Rhodia. It doesn't have to be fancy. It can be right out of your printer. It can be anything you have lying around. This is just for fun. Just before we start, I also want to mention that you can also do this in pencil first if you feel more comfortable. I'm really comfortable just jumping in and doing this with pens, but you can totally do it in pencil first and then trace over it with your pens later. So the first thing I'm going to do is grab my size 03 micron pen. This is a sort of in-between size, and I'm just going to start drawing the flower. So I'll do this step by step, but again, you can use the worksheets that I've provided if you want to do this and have a reference point, but you can watch me do it as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is draw the center of the peony. So if you look at pictures of peonies, there are tons of different ways you can draw them. There are lots of different types of peonies, but I'm just drawing one that I generally use in my own work here. So the first thing I'm going to do is draw the center. Sort of like a weird bean shape, and don't overthink it too much. You don't want it to be super perfectly round. Everything we're going to do in this tutorial is going to be very imperfect, so it doesn't have to look exactly like mine, just this general shape. Next, I'm going to go from the bottom and pull over this petal into the center. So it's sort of like it's wrapping around. So we're going to turn this into sort of a circle here, and it's going to be like that middle part of the peony. So same thing from the other side, but you don't want it to look exactly the same as that first one. You want it to look, again, imperfect. Next, you're going to draw the top and sort of finish off that circle, and then draw as if it's folding into the center. So now it looks like a couple petals that still haven't quite opened up, and that's the middle of our peony. The next thing you're going to do is draw the bottom petal coming out. So this petal is going to look like it's sort of opened and it's folding out. And so what you're going to do is draw sort of a shape like this, again, imperfect and coming out from the center. Then you're going to do one on the opposite side, so on the top, and this one's going to be sort of a bigger, again, imperfect petal. And then you're going to start adding all of your different petals off to the sides. So coming out from the center here, I'm going to draw one that's a little bit like shorter and wider. Same thing from over here. And you're just adding, again, imperfect petals with sort of jagged edges as you go. You'll hear people referring to this as C and S shapes as well. If you want to think that way in long C's and long S's, sometimes it can help. And then lastly, I like to add some in this bottom section too, just to make it sort of rounded off. You don't want your flower to be like perfectly round. That just doesn't happen very often in nature, but you do want it to look sort of pleasing to the eye. So I'm just going to add a couple more around the bottom portion here. And just one more here. There we go. So now I've got the general shape of my flower, and I'm gonna add some folds. So if you look at pictures of peonies, you'll see that sometimes the petals fold over themselves. And so to do that, you're just gonna go to sort of the natural top of some of your petals and add in an extra fold here. So I'm gonna do this on just a few of them, not all of them. And I really only do it in like the top half of the flower, only in this portion and not these bottom ones, because you'll see when we start to add details that the bottom ones are meant to look like they're flipping out and not in. That'll start to make more sense as you play with this a little more too. So I've got the general shape of my flower. Now I'm going to switch to my 01 pen, which is a smaller tip. Again, if you're using the same pen this whole time, all you have to do is press a little bit lighter at this point. We're just doing lighter, finer lines. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna start adding the shading lines. And what you wanna think about when you're doing the shading is that your lines should always be pointing back to the center of the flower, and they should never be straight lines. You wanna make sure they're rounded and they're curved a little bit to make them look more natural. So from this first petal here on the front, I'm gonna start adding some lines of different lengths, curving towards that middle part of the flower. And you can do some from the top and some from the bottom, and just do it really free form. Don't think about it too much. Just some nice little lines into the middle. Okay, so I've gotten them in the middle. Now I'm gonna start adding them to the petals coming out from the middle. So I'm gonna start adding some here. And one thing I like to note on these petals is these spots where there's like a natural crease in them, I like to accentuate with some extra shading. Again, always curved lines, and they're always pointing back to that middle. What I will say is when you're working through your flower, as you get to these petals that are folded, I usually don't add details on those. It's totally a personal preference. I find they just look a little bit better and they pop a little more when there's no detail on them. So I'm only detailing the inside of that petal. Now, once you've done the petals that are in that top quadrant, you're gonna start doing the ones on the bottom. And the shading on these ones is gonna be slightly different because like I mentioned, I want these bottom petals to look like they're folding out and down. So the way you do that is that you start your lines at the top, at the middle, and as you move out towards the edge of the flower, you're gonna start to curve them a little more aggressively as you get to the edges. And you'll notice that that'll make the petal look like it's folding down. So I'm gonna do this same kind of technique for all of the petals that are coming down here at the bottom so that they look like they are layered and underneath and folding out. Okay, last step is to add a little bit of contrast to this. So once you've drawn your outline and the shading, you might notice that it's not really like popping off the page all that much. So the trick to that is to add a little contrast. And I find even if you don't really like the look of your flower at this point, adding the contrast really finishes it off. So I'm gonna take my heavier pen. This is the 05. Again, if you're using the same pen, just make the lines thicker, like manually. You don't need to have a thicker pen. So all I'm gonna do now is go around the edges of all of those petals that I drew. Next, I'm gonna go into the middle of my flower where you notice this sort of big gap. Sometimes the way you draw the petals makes that little hole a little bit smaller, but if it's really big like the way I have it, sometimes I add in a couple more sort of petals that would be folding over each other in there, and then I color in just a tiny piece of it black. So it looks like it's really kind of an inside of the flower. And the very last step that I'm gonna do on this peony is add a little more contrast in certain areas. So where the petals meet each other at the base or where they're overlapping, if you add a little bit of contrast in there, it really makes it pop. So in spots like this where you can see two leaves meeting, two petals meeting, just add some lines in there. And especially around the base of the flower, I find, or the center of the flower, I find adding a little bit of contrast lines can really make it next level. You don't want to do too much, but just a little bit in certain areas. And that's it for the open peony. Now we're going to move on to doing a bud, which is a much smaller, easier version. So to do the bud, we're essentially doing just the first few steps of that peony. So we're going to draw this middle part as if it hasn't quite opened yet. So I'm just going to do the exact same thing with my 03. I'm going to draw that middle sort of bean shape and bring those two pieces around to the middle again. And then finish it off on the top And then I'm gonna keep my 0-3, and I'm gonna draw a really quick and easy stem without thinking about it too much. And if you want to, you can add some leaves. Then I'm gonna take my 0-1 again and do the detail lines, again, curving towards the middle. You can add detail to your leaves too if you want to. And then use my 0-5 to do the contrast. And on this one, I'm just gonna color the middle in fully. And there you have it, the full rounded peony and the peony bud. Now, as I mentioned, these are styles that I use in my own work, and you can draw these a million different ways. So if you want to see an even more detailed peony and you want to get really good at illustrating peonies, I actually had a guest on the show who is amazing at them. Her name's Megan, and we did an interview together where she walked us through step by step a much longer, more detailed process on drawing peonies. So go check that out, and make sure you've subscribed because I release 2 new videos every single week. And lastly, make sure you grab the free worksheet down below, and I'll see you next time.